Hi everyone, this is lecture 1.2, Foundational Concepts. This lecture will be talking about the theory that we need to go on to discuss other things. So we are not going to be talking about specific forms of discrimination just quite yet, but we'll be talking about the ideas that we'll be using to talk about those forms of discrimination. So these are really important concepts to talk about what we need for the rest of the course. So if you have any questions on these concepts, please contact me about that. So I broke this down into, what is that, 7 different sections. First we'll talk about basic definitions, then we'll talk about culture, prejudice and discrimination and how that works. Then we'll talk about privilege, intersectionality, implicit bias, and oppression, and what we mean by all of those things, and many other definitions. I like to break sociology up into its definitions and study those definitions and make that so that you can understand. Let's talk about those basic definitions. Social inequality is something we need to understand what it is. It is defined as the condition of different groups having unequal access to resources, power, and prestige. And in that system, injustices are rationalized on the basis of difference. So the reason why we tell ourselves that certain people are poor, well, it's because they didn't work hard enough, or whatever. The perception is that poor people are lazy, and people say things like, if they didn't want to live like this, they should have worked harder. That is the rationalization of the injustice. Or we have the perception that rich people work hard for what they have. They say, we are the best, we are the smartest, and we deserve the best. This man right here is from a documentary called People Like Us. And he is being interviewed as to what he thinks the virtues of the upper class are, and I'll probably give a link for this documentary, but when you watch this documentary, if you watch this documentary, you're not sure if he's reporting on the upper class or he honestly believes these things, but he says outrageous things such as, well, if you want to be rich, you just have to be the best, and you just have to, be the smartest and the best and the brightest. And those are nice things to say, but they don't match lived reality. They don't match. You're effectively saying, I'm better and I'm more intelligent than you because I have more money than you. And that doesn't match many of everyone's lived realities, and it certainly doesn't match the sociological data. Social diversity we will define as the differences between social identity groups based on socially constructed categories such as race, gender, sexuality, class, and other socially constructed categories. Just because something is socially constructed doesn't mean it's not real, right? We'll talk about definitions of race later on in the course, but race is a socially constructed category that means certain things. But just because race doesn't have much biological rooting, doesn't mean it's not still very socially real. That's a big idea. We'll come back to it later. A related concept is that of multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is an educational and organizational philosophy that encourages greater social diversity and embraces identities associated with diversity. At many college campuses, there are multicultural programs, and those programs are trying to help us get exposure to the greater degree of diversity in our society. Social justice is something that needs to be defined. Social justice is action with the goal of full and equal participation of all groups in a society that is mutually shaped to meet needs. This includes equitable or equal distribution of resources and making sure that all members of society, that their needs of physical and psychological needs are met. I probably could have worded that a little more simply. but that's a reasonable definition. Social justice is a word that gets defined strangely when people start making things political. What we mean by social justice is a condition of everyone getting what they need, right? To be physically secure, to be psychologically secure. That's what we're working toward when we work toward social justice. Let's talk about culture. The basic definition of culture, which you would get in a Social 101 course, are the collected beliefs, behaviors, and understandings of a given group of people. So that's the basic definition. What we don't often talk about in Social 101 are dominant cultures, dominant groups, and other types of groups. A dominant culture are the beliefs, understandings, and preferences of the people who have the most power and resources in society. Dominant groups set the parameters of normal, and they hold the most authority. So you can probably right now think about what the dominant groups in our society are. I'm going to jump around in this slide a little bit. So in our society, the dominant culture is controlled by the rich, white people, heterosexuals, men, able-bodied or non-handicapped people, and Christians. When we talk about what it means to be American, we often are referring to that kind of stuff, right? And we see this in what's considered normal, right? In normal, traditional English, this is changing, but traditional English, we talk about mankind to mean all of humanity. But traditionally, for a long time, and still in some areas, when we talk about mankind, that's implying that male is normal, right? When we talk about skin tone or skin-colored things, we are talking about a beige color that matches white people's skin, right? That's skin-colored. When we talk about special needs, we are talking about somebody whose body is different and therefore are implying that differentness is special and different, and that one of my neighbors his body is different, he has special needs. And that's a little bit different, right? Because it's a nicer word. It's maybe, we get into weirdness of how handicapped has been used in the past. I mean, certainly it's a better word than crippled, right? And it doesn't have heavy connotation, but it still makes them sound different in a way that isn't necessarily helpful. And we'll talk a lot about this language stuff in this course, right? We certainly need to be able to say in a way that somebody's legs don't work, right? Because if we ignore the fact that somebody's legs don't work, then we make it really hard for them to be able to get in a building. But we need to work toward language that doesn't make them sound weird or ostracized in that way. And we'll talk about, this is still the beginning of the course. We'll talk about all of these things. Right now, let's keep talking about dominant culture. Dominant cultures often have what are called hegemonic archetypes. This is defined as the most essential form of the identity. Not every type of identity has these hegemonic archetypes, but some do. The classical example where this term started from was a thing called hegemonic masculinity. The quote-unquote man's man. In which, in our society, all men are encouraged to be as much like this type of man as possible, and any variations on this man are seen as not good or even inferior, right? And this is the first instance in this course where I've mentioned something that is a negative to society. I think most people would agree that we agree that you as a person, as a man or as a woman, as whoever you are, should be who you want to be, right? but this is you should be who you want to be. I know that's a bold and controversial statement. So I say sarcastically. But in our society, there is a phenomena in which all men are encouraged to be like Don Draper or the Clint Eastwood type cowboy, the man's man, the big tough man. And that type of masculinity, that hegemonic type, can be harmful in many ways. And we'll talk about that when we get to sexism. But there is the archetypal black person. There is the archetypal person with a disability, right? And these are the things we have to understand to try to break down how that can be harmful for those kinds of people and for society as a whole. Subordinate culture, then, are those cultures that are not part of the dominant culture. Subordinates are those without power or with less power, and subordinates are typically lesser in numbers. A synonym for this is minority group, but it's difficult to use that term minority group because it's not always less people, right? So, for example, women are systematically discriminated against in society. They are subordinates in terms of power in our society, but numerically, because of how human biology works and how our society works, there are slightly more, roughly 51% women to the 49% of men in society. So it doesn't quite make sense to call women a minority group, but they are certainly subordinate. And they are technically a minority group. It's just words are funny that way. And it's actually important, first time this comes up in this course, to mention that you need to use the sociological definitions for things. If you just Google search minority group, you might get something talking about numbers or whatever. If you Google search any term, don't do that for this course. Stick with the stuff in my lectures and in the readers. Anyway, subordinates are said to be incapable of performing preferred roles. Dominants are perceived to be better. So, examples of this. Women are said to be too emotional. Too emotional compared to what? Compared to men? How true is this? Emotional in what ways? These are the perceptions of society. Latinos are lazy. The stereotypes against Latinos are fascinating and infuriating because Latinos are both too lazy and taking all of our jobs, who is our whatever. But, okay, so these incredibly lazy people are taking everyone's jobs. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever, right? But that is the nature of stereotype. Whites are naturally smarter than other people, or blacks are inherently better athletes, or whatever. These are their perceptions that maintain discrimination in our society effectively. Dominants do not really know the experience of the subordinate. I am a white heterosexual man. And quite frankly, while I have studied this stuff for years, I don't know what it's like. I don't know what it's like to be a woman, right? I don't. I don't know what it's like to be black. I can read about it all I want, but I don't know. And that is a philosophical conversation of what it means to know. I can be told about it. I can be put in given situations. I can't know it, though, the way other people can. I can know about it, but it's not my lived experience. And subordinates are often forced to focus on survival rather than success. So what does that mean? Well, if I were a black man, if I were in various minority groups, it might not make sense to me to fight every single instance of discrimination, right? It doesn't make sense to every slight that might be, every microaggression, we'll talk about this later, that happens. I can't fight every single one. I have to pick my battles. if I want to be successful, right? And you can see page 12 for a great chart of dominant versus submissive or subordinate groups. And these are really interesting ideas we have coming up. There are two types of subordinate cultures, and this is important to know. We have subcultures and countercultures. A subculture is a group that has its own set of values, behaviors, types of dress that coexist within the dominant culture. So a subculture is a group of people that have their own understandings, but they generally get along with the dominant culture, or at least they're not fighting with the dominant culture. An example of this completely mundane would be Detroit Red Wings fans. So hockey fans in general in a lot of American society are they're not part of the mainstream. Hockey isn't like baseball, it isn't like football. There are specific definitions within hockey, and then specifically with Detroit Red Wings fans, they have their own symbols and sets and understandings and traditions. And most sports teams have these things, right? UNM football fans have their set of ideas and set of cultures. A counterculture, then, is a group that has its own set of values, behaviors, and types of dress, just like a subculture, but the counterculture wants to overthrow or change the dominant culture in some way. Examples of this would be the Black Panther Party, who, while they no longer exist the way they did in the 70s, they had different sets of ideas and values, and part of that was to overthrow and change society as it existed. The Green Party in the United States, they don't want to spark violent revolution like the Black Panthers did, but they want to challenge and change society. And a more insidious group, the Ku Klux Klan, they want to change society, they want to challenge society, they want to overthrow society. That's the difference between a subculture and a counterculture. The subculture coexists with society, the counterculture wants to cause social change. And that, that's not talking about in terms of good and bad. It just is what it is. Now, flaunting, then, is something, this could probably use its own slide, because it's a slightly different idea. Flaunting are behaviors by subordinate groups that are offensive to the dominant culture because they are perceived, that's the key word, to challenge or disrespect the dominant culture. So you could see also gay men in non-gay bars, right? A gay man, a openly gay, openly quote-unquote behaving gay man in a non-gay bar could be perceived as a threat to heteronormative gay men, non-gay men, straight men, right? To be disrespecting them, to be flirting with them, to be trying to hit on them, quote-unquote, getting into their pants. That gay guy could just be having a drink, right? But if he's perceived to be doing this behavior, to be quote-unquote flaunting, that we'll talk about in the main part of the course, not outside the lectures, that can cause trouble. It can be a problem. It isn't good that that's seen as a problem, right? The gay man should be allowed to have a drink in a bar. But things can happen based on perceptions, based on homophobic perceptions. And that is a phenomena we'll look at, this flaunting phenomena. Stigma is the condition of being identified as different from the rest of society. The stigmatized person or the stigmatized group are typically treated worse than the non-stigmatized. And this can apply to either groups. I stressed that wrong. This can be applied to either groups, subordinate groups, or individuals, stigma. This is most closely associated with the theorist Erving Goffman, who's one of the foundational sociologists. And this is a topic of great study in sociology, as most discriminated against groups are the victims of stigma. Traditionally, the United States has held an assimilationist mindset regarding culture, this melting pot model, in which we say anyone can come to the United States as long as they act like Americans and speak English when they get here. That is the traditionalist model of how an immigrant should come to the United States. And there are problems with that. A more modern approach, known as the post-assimilationist approach, or what's sometimes called the Mosaic model, is that anyone is allowed to come here as long as they respect other people that are already here, and immigrants are allowed or encouraged to continue with their previous cultural practices. This post-assimilationist, could be called multicultural, Mosaic model, is what is embraced by most colleges and most companies, most government offices. Now let's talk about prejudice, discrimination, and how that relates to implicit bias. Prejudice is a belief that is applied to a given group of people, regardless of evidence against it. So, examples of prejudice would be all black people are criminals, all Mexicans are lazy, right? These are prejudices. These are beliefs that people have. Discrimination, then, is acting on that prejudice. If you were a landlord and you did not rent to black or Mexican people, you would be discriminating against them, and you would be discriminating against them, the action, right, based on the prejudice, the belief, right? And it is important to note that racism and similar phenomena are types of prejudice, but specifically racism and sexism to a degree are more than that. They are complex systems of interwoven institutions in our society, right? Racism is a belief system, but it is also a social structure in our society. Should those two things have different terms? Yeah, they absolutely should, but they don't yet. Sorry about that. So it gets confusing. But we'll talk about that more when we talk about race specifically, and I will lay out how racism has been created in the United States and hasn't always been what it is. And that itself is a fascinating topic. Modern prejudice is paradoxical. If you're not super familiar with paradoxes, they're things that don't make sense. They exist, they don't make sense, but they still are in our society, right? So here's the paradox. It is socially unacceptable to be openly, that should be prejudiced. Sorry about that typo. It's unacceptable to be racist, right? It's unacceptable to be sexist. And most parts of our society, that's unacceptable. But our society still is racist and sexist. Well, how can that be? How does that exist? That's a paradox. Well, there are very specific answers to these, and we will be studying these answers in this course. The first answer is implicit bias. And this is really a very useful concept for understanding micro-level prejudice and discrimination. The vast majority of individuals possess prejudice against stigmatized groups, and they're completely unaware of it. So it is possible that you think racism is terrible, but you might be subconsciously racist. That's the idea there. And this is present even in individuals who are ideologically opposed to prejudice beliefs. So therefore, someone working for an LGBT rights group can still be subconsciously homophobic. They can still have subconscious preferences for heterosexual people. And this is not that person's fault. This is how they've been wired by society. That's the idea of implicit bias. Now, implicit bias in action, where do we see this in our society? Here are some examples. The vast majority of police brutality cases against usually African American males, but can also be other groups. If you study these things, you find implicit bias. The officer that did the thing, that did some act of violence, could be a white man married to a black woman, right? Or with many, many black friends. But in that moment of stress, that wiring in his brain came out, and he winds up shooting a teenage boy who was just trying to get his wallet out instead of a gun, right? That's where implicit bias is. And we'll talk about more about implicit bias as the course goes on. Businesses that only have white people working for them, even though they live in a African American community. That would be because of the implicit bias of those who are hiring, right? They might say, "Yeah, we hire all kinds of people. We don't care." And they might honestly believe that. But when it comes down to who you think is more trustworthy, who you think would get along best at this company, well, that might be rooted in subconscious processes going on in your own brain. And that's, that could sound like just a philosophy, right? And that's the difference between philosophy and science. Implicit bias can be tested. And implicit bias is empirically observable. You can go test this yourself. You can go to implicit.harvard.edu, get your own implicit bias test. You can find out how you are implicitly biased. And it's relatively reliable. And this test is useful for macro level observations, but it can help you. So what I'm saying with that is that the reason Harvard hosts that implicit bias test is because they're studying society as a whole. They're not necessarily studying you, Jenny Newton. If I have a Jenny Newton in this class, I just made that name up. But they're not necessarily trying to study Jenny Newton. They are trying to study society as a whole. So if they can't tell you exactly how you are racist, but they might be able to say, yeah, you might want to work on that, right? But it is good for studying society as a whole. And it's an interesting test, so just go check that out. Another thing to note there is that the more you take it, the less predictable it comes, because the engine for it is based off of making the test hard for you. So if you get really good at taking the test, it actually takes down the predictability aspect to it. Anyway, though, if you do find you have some implicit bias, it can be fixed. And that's the good news of implicit bias, is that once you determine that you have an implicit bias, you can fix it. And that is one of the most astounding findings of sociology, of social science in the modern era. So if you find you have an anti-black implicit bias, go read a book by Martin Luther King, or go read the autobiography of Malcolm X, or go watch Do the Right Thing by Spike Lee. And by exposing yourself to that, what they call that, the exemplary example, I think that's what they call that, it can reduce implicit bias after exposure. And that's fascinating too. It doesn't necessarily get rid of it entirely, but it can make you a lot better as a person if you don't like that implicit bias test that you took that said, yeah, you might be racist, right? You can fix it, which is scientifically absolutely fascinating. Let's talk about privilege, which is something we talk about a lot in this course, and talk about a lot in society, but let's define it. Privilege is when one group has something of value that is denied to others simply because of the group they belong to, rather than anything that they have done or failed to do. And cultural domination by a dominant culture results in privilege. We have some great examples of privilege on page 19. Here are some examples. I believe I made all these up. I don't think I took these from the book, but please forgive me if I did. Examples of privilege would be white people, this is white privilege, can travel nearly anywhere in the world without being questioned by authorities. Sure, you get questions, why are you going there, what are you doing there? But an Indian family going to Niagara Falls has to worry if they'll be separated from their children at the border when they try to come back to the United States. This is actually, these are friends of mine. A friend of mine had to decide whether she actually wanted to go over to see the Canadian side of the falls because she's white, but she could pass for Indian, and she's married to an Indian man, and her 2 children are racially mixed, but they appear Indian, right? And she needed to decide if it was worth the risk to go over the falls, right? Because she was afraid she would be separated from her children. And that is not something that would have occurred to me as a white person a white man married to a white woman with white children. And me not having to deal with that, that's white privilege. A heterosexual man can drink at a bar without fear of assault, while a homosexual man has to worry that he will be perceived as hitting on other men to be assaulted. Similarly, women have to worry about how they present themselves at bars for fear of being raped, for fear of quote-unquote asking for it, right? That is heterosexual privilege. That is male privilege on my part, being able to go to basically any bar I want, even gay bars. I can go to any bar I want and not have a fear of being raped or assaulted for my behavior. That's privilege. A non-disabled person can be confident that they'll be able to go into any public building. That's privilege. Even though it is against the law to have a building that disabled people can't get into, it still exists. If it's a historic type building, if it's a building of a small organization, they might not be required to have ramps, etc. And my ability to go upstairs, because stairs are constructed for people whose legs work in a typical fashion, that's privileged on my part. And a cisgender person, so a person who is not trans, does not have to worry if they will be allowed to use a public restroom. That's privilege. That's absolutely privilege. Trans people have to worry if they'll be able to find a bathroom to go to when they're in public, because people are afraid of trans people using the bathroom. And it's not that's privilege, right? Let's talk about intersectionality. Your personal identity is made of a series of intersections. So examples of intersectional identities that we all have are race, class, sexual identity, religion. There are others, right? But these intersectional identities combine to make your specific identity. And different combinations of identities create different perspectives. So the perspective of a rich, white, gay man is different than the perspective of a rich, white, straight man, right? So the difference between those two guys with what we're talking about is the difference between a gay guy and a straight guy. And then, but those two men, the rich white gay man, the rich white straight man, have more in common, more identities in common than the middle class straight black man, right? Because the middle class straight black man has those identities of middle class, straight, black, and man, but all three of these individuals have that common identity of man or male, right? And so they have that identity in common. And intersectionality is really very interesting, and it's very important to remember because it changes how people interact in society. And in the book, Tatum calls it the complexity of identity. And this is explored in detail in your book. And it's really very worthwhile. And it's a very important idea, both for modern theory on discrimination and this course itself. So if you have questions on that, please let me know. Those in a privileged category rarely state their identity in terms of that category. So out members of the LGBT community may mention their sexuality, right? I have a friend, Lauren, who is a lesbian, and she talks about her being a lesbian all the time. Me as a heterosexual, I almost never talk about myself being straight, right? I don't talk about I am a man married to a woman, right? I don't talk about that, but my friend Lauren does, because she feels she has to assert herself that way because she is made subordinate in our society, right? White students rarely mention being white when asked, "Who are you?" So who are you? What's your deal, right? If you're on the phone talking to someone for the first time, right? And if white students do mention being white, it's because they feel oppressed, right? So what white nationalists or other racists would say, right? And that's important to understand too. Racism, being a part of a racist group is, I will say this, absolutely reprehensible, but we need to understand those people too, right? We need to understand them to know how to deal with them in society. And a skinhead or a Nazi or whatever kind of white nationalist one would be feels as if they are oppressed, right? And that's why that white student might be talking about, well, I'm white, right? It's very, very interesting. Anyway, we have border identities as well. And those are the in-between identities. So mixed race people that aren't obviously one race or another, or maybe are obviously one race or another. Bisexual people, especially a bisexual man who is married to a woman, right? Those are in-between identities. Adopted children, maybe adopted white children whose parents are black, right? Those are in-between people. Second generation immigrants, right? So let's say you are you are an American woman, but you were born to Lebanese parents, right? That makes you a second generation immigrant. But that also makes you are American by birth, but you're Lebanese by heritage. What does that mean? What does that border identity mean? That's an interesting set of questions. And then we also have disadvantage by association, which is slightly different. These are people who are part of those dominant groups, but because of their relationships and association, they have relationships with the disadvantaged class. So a white woman married to a black man has all of the advantages of white privilege on her own, but because of her relationship with a black man, has to at least observe and deal with racism in some ways. A heterosexual father of a lesbian, similarly, he experiences discrimination against gay people because even if he doesn't directly experience it, he observes that discrimination. And that is a different phenomena as well. Let's talk specifically about oppression. Privilege and oppression are both socially constructed. The difference between oppression and other forms of discrimination is that oppression is systematic and inescapable, right? So because of that, members of dominant groups might be discriminated against in highly specific situations, but they cannot be oppressed. Let me check this next slide just here in a second. Yeah, so let me give an example. You can be... I'm sorry, one second. Yeah, okay, I'll get to it anyway. So let's just say it that way. Members of dominant groups might be discriminated against, but they can't be oppressed. So if you're a white person in the United States, you can't be oppressed. That's all there is to it. For being white, anyway. You could be oppressed for being gay or be oppressed for being a woman, but you can't be oppressed for being white as a white person in the United States. If that sounds like it doesn't make any sense or you have examples against it, please wait a couple slides and then it should click together. So, is it oppression? And this is discussed on page 22 of your book. It is oppression if it is pervasive. So, oppression happens everywhere, right? So if you are being discriminated against for that thing everywhere or the vast majority of places in society, then that's one part of it being oppression. And usually oppression has to be all of these things. Is it restrictive? Is it, if it keeps you from doing things you want to do, then it's oppression. Is it, oppression says that some people are better than others, some are at the top, some are the middle, or some at the bottom, right? Our society says that, for example, white people are at the top, and our society says the black people are at the bottom. Again, that's another thing. It's not a good thing, but that's the hierarchy of our society. It is complex, multiple, cross-cutting. So it is, oppression is intersectional. Oppression typically includes multiple identities. So, for example, black women are oppressed by the system of racism and the system of patriarchy or sexism. And is it internalized? Those who are oppressed have been told that they should be oppressed their whole lives. And internalization is a big deal because it is not the same thing to call a white person a cracker or a honky. It's silly, right? It's almost nonsensical. That is not the same thing as actual racial slurs that I'm not going to say. Because those racial slurs hold emotional weight and they hold psychological trauma often for people who have been subject to those slurs. So the white person has not been called a cracker in most cases when they have been attacked or assaulted or belittled or demeaned, right? So that insult of cracker hasn't been internalized. So it's not the same thing, effectively. So here's an example of non-oppression. This is an example of discrimination, but is not example of oppression. So if a black shop owner does not like white people, so he is prejudiced against white people, and as such he will not sell to white people. In this situation, white people are being discriminated against, but they are not being oppressed because there are other shops that they could go to. So that is discrimination without oppression. An example of oppression would be that in 2005, if two men wanted to get married, and at that time same-sex marriage was not recognized in the United States, there was no place in the country in 2005 where such a couple could have the same privileges as, and that should say opposite-sex couple. Thus, the same-sex couple, the two men that wanted to get married, were being oppressed. And that is prior to 2015 when the Supreme Court ruled that same-sex marriage was the law of the land, right? So those two guys getting married, or their inability to get married and recognized by the state, was oppression, right? There was nowhere they could go to get married and get the legal benefits of marriage, and therefore it was oppression. If you have questions about, that's a complex idea. I think I laid it out pretty as well as I could. If you have questions about that, please let me know. Now, an example of subtle oppression, because this is how most oppression happens, is subtly. Students are required to take the ACTs to get into most colleges. However, non-native English speakers have been shown to be at a distinct disadvantage on the test because they often miss out on subtle cues or hints within the test. So, for example, on the ACT or similar tests, the SAT, other tests like that, you might have a question, dog is to puppy as cat is to, and probably you're automatically just filling in the word kitten, right? Well, dogs are not common pets in the Arab world, and thus a student could hypothetically miss this question if they have no cultural exposure to dogs, right? If you just got to the United States 2 years ago, you are a linguistic marvel. You learned English super duper fast, but your family does not have dogs or puppies or whatever. You don't know what that word puppy means. Then this could take down your perfect ACT score down by a couple points. That is subtle and minor oppression, right? It's just a little bit. It's just a little piece, right? But those little bits and those little pieces add up over time. That's what oppression looks like in the world where we're trying to stop it, right? And we're trying to stop it, but we're not perfect yet. It's important. There's some important points to remember regarding oppression. All forms of oppression are interconnected. Oppression holds up the status quo in society. And in our society, capitalism is part of the status quo. We'll talk about capitalism in more detail when we talk about class specifically. But, anyway. Individuals can be oppressive. They do not oppress. Individual people who are discriminatory do not oppress. Structure oppresses, right? Because the individual shop owner that says, no, I don't serve black people, I don't serve white people, they are being discriminatory, but the ability to go to another shop or inability to go to another shop, that is the oppression. That is the structure of society. It may be that one group is more oppressive than another group. As I mentioned previously, these conversations become quickly divisive and do not lead to community building. No one wins the oppression Olympics. That might be a tattoo I get, right? No one wins the oppression Olympics. It doesn't benefit us to say, well, gay people are a whole lot more oppressed than disabled people. Or, I'm just saying things, I don't mean these things right now. Or, well, Latinos, they're the ones that are really being oppressed. Black people aren't being oppressed anymore by our society, right? Those conversations, they just cause arguments. They're not really that helpful. Conversations about how social structures can be changed for all people are much more productive and effective. And we see that when studying social movement organizations. We see which are the groups that succeed and which are the groups that are effective. And when they focus on that kind of building, that's when they succeed. And the cycle of socialization perpetuates all forms of oppression. We learn how to be oppressed and how to perpetuate oppression. So that process of socialization you learned about in Social 101, of how we learn to be individuals, how we learn to interact with all aspects of society, we learn that stuff. And in order to get rid of racism, sexism, ableism, all of that, we have to unlearn. Well, first we have to learn how we've been oppressed, and then we have to internalize and unlearn that stuff, right? We have to unroot the implicit bias, right? And hopefully in these last couple sentences, because I gave you all these crazy definitions, you know what I'm talking about there. This lecture is really important because of all of these definitions, because I'll be throwing out terms like implicit bias and oppression, and I'll expect you to know what I mean when I say those things. So if you have any questions on that, please let me know. The vocabulary is incredibly important for this course. You'll see that -30 that means that this lecture is done. So I'll talk to you soon in the discussion boards or wherever.